The Vietnam War was one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century. A war fought in dense jungles, through endless rain, ambushes, and battles that pushed men beyond human limits. Some of these battles became legends, but others were buried, forgotten in time. This is the story of 5 of those forgotten campaigns, where courage met chaos, where heroes stood their ground against impossible odds, and where entire units disappeared into the mist of Vietnam's unforgiving jungles. From the deadly slopes of Ripcord to the burning fields of Coral Balmoral, the blood-soaked DMZ of Quang Tri, the Siege of Khe Sanh, and the final secret mission, Operation Thunderhead. These are the stories they tried to erase. But before we begin, let's take a moment to remember the real heroes. The men who lived it, fought it, and never came home. We owe it to them to never forget. And don't forget to let us know in the comments which of the battles left the biggest impact on you. They called it 23 Days in Hell. In the blistering summer of 1970, as the Vietnam War seemed to inch toward its long-awaited end, one of its fiercest and most overlooked battles was just beginning. While politicians in Washington spoke of peace and withdrawal, deep in the jungles of South Vietnam, American soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division were fighting for their lives. Their mission: hold a lonely outpost called Firebase Ripcord, perched on a remote hilltop in the treacherous Etched Valley. What started as a routine effort to support a larger campaign quickly escalated into a brutal siege. Cut off from all sides, the Screaming Eagles found themselves surrounded by thousands of North Vietnamese troops determined to wipe them out. Helicopters became their only lifeline. Every supply drop, every evacuation, every moment was a gamble against death. For 23 grueling days, the men of Firebase Ripcord endured relentless mortar fire, close quarters ambushes, and attacks from an enemy who knew the jungle better than anyone. What they faced wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was psychological torment. Yet through the chaos, these soldiers held the line, rewriting the meaning of courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. This is not just a story of war. This is a story of grit, brotherhood, and the human cost of forgotten battles. This is the story of Firebase Ripcord. Firebase Ripcord wasn't just another dot on the map. It was a pressure point in one of the most dangerous regions of South Vietnam, the Etched Valley. This narrow jungle corridor, stretching along the Laotian border, served as a vital supply route for the North Vietnamese Army, NVA. Hidden beneath its dense canopy were the secret arteries of war, trails, tunnels, and hidden depots that fed enemy operations across the South. To disrupt these lifelines, the U.S. launched Operation Texas Star, and later the planned but never executed Operation Chicago Peak. Both depended on one thing: controlling the high ground. And that's where Firebase Ripcord came in. Perched atop Hill 927, Ripcord was more than a hilltop camp. It was designed as a fire support base, a place to station artillery and launch operations deeper into enemy territory. From its elevated position, U.S. forces could rain down fire on NVA movements, shield their own troops, and push forward into a zone the enemy had long considered their own. But building Ripcord was a gamble. It required constant resupply by helicopter, making it dangerously dependent on weather and air superiority. And the moment the first American boots touched the hilltop, the enemy was already watching. They knew that Ripcord was the key to U.S. dominance in the region, and they were willing to sacrifice everything to destroy it. Despite being remote, the base was fortified quickly. Engineers leveled the summit, set up howitzer batteries, dug deep bunkers, and wrapped the perimeter with wire and mines. Still, no amount of sandbags could guarantee safety. Ripcord sat in a bowl surrounded by higher jungle-cloaked ridgelines, perfect cover for an approaching enemy. American commanders hoped to keep the fire base secure long enough to support a major offensive. What they got instead was a relentless siege. The NVA wasn't just planning to challenge the U.S. presence, they aimed to crush it entirely. In the weeks that followed, Ripcord transformed from a forward artillery point into the center of a brutal, unforgiving standoff. The jungle whispered with enemy movement, and every sunrise brought new uncertainty. From the outside, it may have looked like just another nameless hill. But to the soldiers who were there, Ripcord became a place they would never forget, a place where strategy met survival. It started like any other humid morning in the Aishal Valley. Thick jungle mist, low-flying clouds, and the distant hum of chopper blades. Inside the Tactical Operations Center at Firebase Ripcord, Lieutenant Colonel Andre Lucas scanned fresh intel reports. He knew something was coming. What he didn't know was that July 1st would mark the beginning of one of the most punishing battles of the Vietnam War. Suddenly, the calm shattered. A mortar round slammed into the TOC entrance, ripping through the fortified sandbags like paper. Within seconds, dozens more rained down, exploding across the base in brutal rhythm. The men hit the ground, scrambled to their fighting positions, and braced for what would become 23 days of relentless warfare. From the hills around Ripcord, thousands of NVA soldiers had encircled the base. For weeks, they'd been quietly moving into position, camouflaged beneath jungle cover, hidden in bunkers, watching every move. Now they attacked with ruthless precision. Waves of AK-47 fire, RPGs, and mortar strikes hammered the base as the American soldiers fought back with 105mm and 155mm howitzers, machine guns, and air support. But even the might of American firepower struggled to punch through the dense green shield of the jungle. The enemy was invisible, dug in deep along ridgelines like Hill 805. So close, yet unseen. Flares lit up the canopy at night, but often revealed nothing but shadows and silence. Within 15 minutes of the first mortar strike, the sky above Ripcord filled with helicopters and jets. O-6A scout planes hovered low to mark enemy targets, while Cobra gunships and F-4 Phantom jets launched strikes against suspected NVA positions. Napalm, rockets, and bombs slammed into the hills. And still, the enemy fired back. This wasn't just a firefight, it was psychological warfare. Mortars landed without warning. Sleep became a luxury. Soldiers would wake from shallow naps to the sound of screaming or explosions. Many didn't sleep at all, and yet they held. Day after day, under constant bombardment, Ripcord's defenders didn't back down. Helicopters flew through withering fire to deliver supplies, ammo, and evacuate the wounded. Every landing was a gamble. Some choppers never made it out. Lucas, a commanding officer known for being calm under pressure, walked the perimeter daily, checking positions, talking to his men, urging them to stay strong. They respected him not just because he gave orders, but because he stood with them, in the mud, under fire. What was supposed to be a quick operation to secure high ground had become a life-or-death stand. Firebase Ripcord was now a battlefield, and the enemy wasn't letting go. If Firebase Ripcord was the heart of the battle, then the surrounding hills were its lungs, essential for survival and just as vulnerable. Holding the high ground meant more than just visibility. It meant life or death. The hills around Ripcord, Hill 902, Hill 805, and Hill 1000, became the focal points of an escalating war. To secure them, American troops were ordered into dense jungle, unforgiving terrain, and ambush after ambush. The enemy had no intention of giving them up without a bloodbath. Hill 805, fire from above. Hill 805, southeast of Ripcord, was one of the first priorities. From this vantage point, the NVA launched near constant mortar fire at the base. Bravo Company was sent in to take it. The assault began under a hail of bullets. Soldiers were forced to jump from helicopters hovering above the LZ, landing straight into enemy fire. The terrain was brutal, steep, muddy, with thick vegetation that masked NVA bunkers. The North Vietnamese had the high ground, perfect firing positions, and the advantage of camouflage. It felt like fish in a barrel, but Bravo Company pushed forward. Inch by inch, tree by tree, they climbed the hill, returning fire when they could, diving for cover when they couldn't. Cobra gunships provided critical air support, targeting an enemy bunker at the summit. Once that position was neutralized, the firing slowed, and Bravo Company secured the hill. They spent the night under constant threat, setting up flares and tripwires, waiting for the inevitable. And just past midnight, the enemy came. RPGs and gunfire tore through the dark, but the Americans held steady, firing only when necessary to avoid revealing their positions. By dawn, the enemy had retreated. Hill 805 was theirs, but it had come at a cost. Just a few kilometers away, Charlie Company faced a very different outcome. Stationed on Hill 902, they had compromised their position by firing on enemy mortar sites. Expecting a counterattack, Captain Hewitt requested to withdraw and reposition. Lieutenant Colum Lucas refused. The hill, he said, was too strategically important. That night, disaster struck. NVA sappers, stripped down and covered in charcoal for camouflage, crept silently through the perimeter. Poorly dug foxholes and lax defensive positions left the company vulnerable. Chaos erupted as the sappers attacked key positions, including the command post. Captain Hewitt was among the first killed. Under fire from all sides, Charlie Company fought through the night in confusion and terror. When morning broke, the true cost was visible. 7 men dead, many more wounded. The hill was held, but barely. The price of that decision echoed through every surviving man. But the fiercest and most prolonged fighting would be for Hill 1000, northwest of the base. This hill was a constant source of NVA fire. Mortars, 51 caliber machine guns, and psychological pressure. On July 6th, a recon team led by Sergeant Granberry was sent to scout enemy positions. They moved slowly, listening for mortars, staying low. When they located the NVA sites and requested artillery fire, command instead ordered them to attack. It was suicidal, but orders were orders. The team crawled toward the enemy. When they were spotted, RPGs lit up the jungle. Nearly every man was hit. The radio was down. Granberry, wounded, ran through gunfire to find Delta Company for backup. Assistant team leader John Schnarr carried a severely wounded comrade on his back as the team fell back down the slope. It was a miracle they made it out alive. The next day, Delta Company replaced them and tried to take the hill. Private Michael Grimm was killed instantly by a sniper. From then on, it was a storm of machine gun fire from well-concealed bunkers. Captain Riso fought like hell, using grenades and his shotgun to lead the charge. But without air support and no clear targets, they were pinned down. Command demanded a second assault. Riso refused. His men were exhausted, their ammo low. He knew they'd be wiped out if they tried again. Lieutenant Colonel Lucas disagreed and relieved him of command, accusing him of cowardice. A new plan was drawn for July 8th, a two-pronged attack involving Charlie and Delta companies. But Charlie had only 30 men and Delta barely 50. The plan fell apart almost immediately. Charlie advanced first and took the full brunt of enemy fire while Delta stalled behind. The jungle echoed with gunfire and screams. Captain Wilcox led a charge across an open saddle, just 15 seconds long, ending in more dead and wounded. Exhausted and furious, Wilcox dragged his wounded down the hill only to find Delta soldiers relaxing below. One of his sergeants, Berkey, snapped, nearly firing on a fellow American. It was a moment that showed just how deeply the strain of this battle was affecting the men. Wilcox later refused to carry out another attack. For that, he too was relieved of command. But many believed his decisions saved lives. The hill remained in enemy hands. A final assault on July 12th failed again. Soon after the brass gave up, Hill 1000 had cost too much, and still it wasn't theirs. In every war, leadership is tested under fire. At Firebase Ripcord, it was forged in it. Surrounded, outgunned, and under siege for over 3 weeks, the men of the 101st Airborne Division needed more than tactics. They needed courage, clarity, and someone willing to stand shoulder to shoulder with them in the mud. For better or worse, the decisions made in those days would shape not only the battle, but how the soldiers viewed their leaders and themselves. At the center of it all was Lieutenant Colonel Andre Lucas, the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry. Calm, composed, and relentless in his dedication to his men, Lucas was everywhere. He didn't lead from a safe desk. He walked the perimeter, checked foxholes, encouraged exhausted troops, and directed fire missions under live attack. When shells fell, he didn't duck. He moved faster, shouting orders, keeping chaos at bay. His commitment came at a price. On July 23rd, just as the final evacuation was underway, a mortar round exploded near Lucas. He was gravely wounded and died shortly after being lifted off the hill by helicopter. For his bravery and leadership, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Many of his men would later say, "He didn't send us through hell, he went there with us." But leadership wasn't just about rank. Valor came from all sides. from captains to privates, from medics to radio operators. Captain Riso, who defied orders for the sake of his men's survival, showed quiet strength. Sergeant Granberry, who ran wounded through enemy fire to find help for his recon team. John Schnarr, who refused to leave an injured teammate behind and carried him down a mountain under fire. These weren't just soldiers, they were lifelines. There were also moments of breakdown where men snapped under the pressure, like Sergeant Berkey, who nearly fired on fellow Americans in frustration. But even those moments told the story of Ripcord, not just the battle against an enemy, but the battle inside every man, the fight to stay human in the middle of madness. Despite the tension between front-line soldiers and distant commanders, the men of Ripcord proved again and again that courage wasn't rare. It was routine. It happened in silence, in sweat, in refusal to give in. These weren't supermen. They were tired, terrified, and hungry, but they stood their ground. And in the end, that's what leadership looked like. Not perfection, not flawless plans, but standing up when it mattered most, and never walking away from your men. By mid-July 1970, Firebase Ripcord had become more than a strategic outpost. It was a bleeding wound in the middle of the jungle. The hills that were supposed to protect it, Hill 805, Hill 902, Hill 1000, had all either fallen or remained contested. The surrounding ridges were now in the hands of the enemy. Every day, mortar rounds pounded the base. Every hour brought another injury. Helicopters that once brought hope now came under fire, crashing in flames or limping away scarred. The Screaming Eagles were still fighting, but they were hanging on by a thread. The base was running on fumes. Supplies were low, casualties were mounting, and morale was cracking. Men hadn't slept in days. Many were down to a single change of socks, a couple of magazines of ammo, and a fraying grip on sanity. General Sidney Berry, Assistant Division Commander for the 101st Airborne, saw the writing on the wall. The question wasn't whether Ripcord could be held. It was whether it was worth holding anymore. He wrestled with the decision. Pulling out meant giving up ground, and for many officers that was unthinkable. It felt like retreat. Worse, it felt like defeat. But Berry understood the broader picture. To throw more troops into Ripcord was to risk a political disaster, one that might unravel the entire Vietnamization strategy, which aimed to transfer combat roles to South Vietnamese forces. Reinforcing Ripcord might have made tactical sense, but it was a strategic liability. On July 22nd, Berry made the call. Firebase Ripcord would be evacuated. The order shocked many, including Colonel Harrison, who had just been preparing for another major assault. He believed the hills around Ripcord were critical to the upcoming Operation Chicago Peak. But the decision was final. The risks were too high. The cost had become too great. Evacuation began at dawn on July 23rd. Soldiers packed supplies, disassembled gear, and prepared for what felt like an impossible task, leaving without losing more men. Choppers arrived under fire. Some were hit as they hovered, as some were forced to turn back. One Chinook, attempting to extract a bulldozer, was struck mid-air and exploded, sending flaming wreckage across the hilltop. And then came the final blow. As he moved across the base coordinating airstrikes and helping with the evacuation, Lieutenant Colonel Andre Lucas was hit by a mortar round. He was rushed to a medevac, but his wounds were too severe. The leader who had stayed with his men through every minute of the siege would not live to see the final helicopter lift off. His death devastated the battalion. He had been the heart of the defense. By 2:07 p.m., the last group of soldiers boarded the final helicopter. No one was left behind. One scout, temporarily lost during the chaos, was rescued later in a daring, low-flying mission by a volunteer pilot. It was the kind of act that had defined the entire fight. Risk everything, leave no one behind. Once the men were clear, the U.S. launched a brutal aerial response. B-52 bombers carpet-bombed the firebase and its surroundings, aiming to deny the North Vietnamese any victory, any gain from their siege. The jungle lit up in fireballs and shockwaves. The hill was turned into craters and ash. The withdrawal from Ripcord wasn't celebrated. It was mourned. But many believed it was the right decision. A base could be rebuilt. The lives of soldiers could not. When the last helicopter lifted off from Firebase Ripcord on July 23, 1970, the sky still echoed with the sound of gunfire and explosions. The evacuation may have been complete, But the war hadn't ended, it simply moved on. For the soldiers who survived those 23 harrowing days, Ripcord would never just be a battlefield. It would remain a permanent scar, etched into memory, body, and soul. In the weeks that followed, the U.S. bombed the area surrounding Ripcord with a ferocity rarely seen in the war. B-52 strikes, airdrop napalm, and artillery barrages turned the jungle into a wasteland of twisted trees and scorched earth. The goal was clear: erase the firebase from the map and deny the North Vietnamese any benefit from their relentless siege. What couldn't be held would be destroyed, but nothing could erase the toll already paid. 75 American soldiers were killed. Over 400 were wounded. The 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry, went from a fighting force to a battered remnant. Entire squads had been wiped out. Men who had arrived on the hill as strangers had bled, fought, and mourned together. What they endured was more than combat. It was survival under impossible conditions. Yet for decades, the Battle of Firebase Ripcord was largely forgotten. Overshadowed by larger, more publicized battles like Khe Sanh and Hammerberger Hill, Ripcord received little attention in official records or media coverage. Part of this was timing. The battle occurred during the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, as attention shifted to Vietnamization and winding down the war. Leaders were reluctant to highlight a costly battle that ended in evacuation. But among the men who were there, Ripcord was never forgotten. They carried the battle with them, through nightmares, scars, and the weight of loss. Reunions were held in later years. Books were written, medals were awarded, some posthumously. Lieutenant Colonel Andre Lucas was awarded the Medal of Honor, not just for bravery under fire, but for choosing to lead from the front, knowing full well it might cost him his life. Many veterans of Ripcord would later say it was the fiercest combat they had ever experienced, even compared to other major Vietnam battles. What made it unique wasn't just the intensity, but the sense of isolation. A base completely surrounded, supplied only by air, left to hold its ground against impossible odds. Over time, Ripcord's story began to surface. Military historians, veterans, and documentarians helped bring the battle back into the public eye. It became a symbol not just of sacrifice, but of resilience, of ordinary soldiers doing extraordinary things when no one was watching and no help was coming. In many ways, the Battle of Ripcord came to represent the Vietnam War itself. Brave men caught in a political storm, sent to fight for hills with unclear meaning, and asked to give everything for objectives that shifted with every passing week. But their courage was real. Their endurance was legendary. And though Ripcord fell, the Screaming Eagles never broke. They fought until the final shot, lifted each other out of hell, and carried the weight of that hilltop with them for the rest of their lives. It was the last major battle between U.S. and North Vietnamese troops. After Ripcord, the war changed, the pace slowed, the focus shifted. But for those 23 days in the summer of 1970, the A Shau Valley burned with a fire that would never be forgotten. Just after midnight, the jungle exploded. North of Saigon, 100 Australian soldiers were fighting for their lives. Artillery crews abandoned their guns and picked up rifles. Infantrymen faced waves of North Vietnamese soldiers surging through the dark, screaming. Trenches were barely dug. No barbed wire, no mercy. If fire support base Coral fell, they'd all be slaughtered. But this wasn't just another firefight in Vietnam. It was the beginning of the most intense and sustained battle Australian forces would face in the entire war. And hardly anyone outside of Australia talks about it. The Battle of Balmoral lasted nearly a month. It pushed Australian infantry, artillery, and tank crews to their breaking point. It changed how Australia fought in Vietnam. And it proved that when the enemy came in force, the Australians stood their ground, shoulder to shoulder, with their American allies. This is not a story of perfect strategy. This is a story of survival, of grit, and of one of the bloodiest chapters of Australia's Vietnam War, nearly erased from history. Until now. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe. Over 90% of our viewers aren't subscribed yet, and it helps us keep telling these stories, the ones history forgot. Let's dive into the forgotten hell of Coral and Balmoral. In early 1968, South Vietnam was reeling. The Tet Offensive had shattered any illusion of a quick victory, blasting through embassies, city streets, and the nightly news back home. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong paid a terrible price in casualties, but they had proven they could strike anywhere, anytime. Allied commanders knew the enemy would try to regroup north of Saigon, along hidden jungle corridors feeding men and supplies into the capital region. If those arteries stayed open, the next offensive might be even deadlier. Enter Australia's first task force, fresh from months of pacification work in Phuoc Tuy province. Canberra had promised Washington more muscle, and this, Operation Toan Thang, was the bill coming due. 2 infantry battalions, artillery batteries, combat engineers, medics, and helicopter pilots were told to move fast, cut the enemy's retreat lines, and establish fire support bases deep in hostile country. American intelligence said resistance would be light. Reality would prove otherwise. Helicopters beat the humid air as soldiers spilled onto a patch of red earth christened Fire Support Base Coral. The scene should have raised alarms. No razor wire, no cleared fields of fire, no overlapping arcs from the guns. Men who had spent the flight rehearsing safety drills now found themselves hacking out foxholes with entrenching tools the size of garden spades. Their positions were a kilometer apart, an eternity in jungle warfare. Daylight vanished behind thunderclouds, and with it, any chance to finish the perimeter. Yet spirits ran high. Australians had earned a reputation for aggressive patrolling and sharp bushcraft, honed in Malaya and Borneo. They trusted their officers, trusted the big American howitzers barking on the ridge, and trusted the rumor that the NVA had been mauled during Tet. Besides, the Yanks helicopter lifeline hovered just a radio call away. What could go wrong? Plenty. Unbeknownst to Allied planners, 3 seasoned NVA regiments were already moving south, loaded with fresh ammunition and revenge on their minds. Scouts watched every sandbag stacked at Coral, counting the guns and mapping the gaps. They reported back that the new base was green, exposed, and ripe for the taking. Orders were issued: destroy the Australians before they could dig in. Another fire support base, Balmoral, was already marked as the next target. As dusk settled on the 12th of May, a hot wind rustled the rubber trees and stirred the acrid smell of cordite. In the distance, a lone claymore mine snapped, then silence. The jungle seemed to breathe in. Everyone at Coral knew the enemy was out there. No one yet grasped how close or how determined that enemy was. On May 12, 1968, elements of the 1st Australian Task Force were flown into an open field roughly 20 kilometers north of Bien Hoa, just outside the operational reach of their usual base at Nui Dat. Their mission: establish a fire support base to intercept retreating North Vietnamese Army units still reeling from the Tet offensive. They named it Fire Support Base Coral. From the start, almost everything went wrong. The helicopters arrived late, troops landed in scattered formations, and supplies were dropped far from where they were needed. Crucial equipment, like barbed wire and defensive materials, arrived hours after the infantry had already begun setting up. Even the artillery guns, the heart of any fire base, were deployed before proper perimeter defenses were in place. The terrain wasn't helping. The dense jungle surrounding Coral was an ideal hiding spot for enemy forces. The visibility was poor, the heat punishing, and the soil dry and hard. Nearly impossible to dig deep trenches in a hurry, but the Australians had no choice. They had to get to work. Fast. Most soldiers had no idea they were sitting on top of a major North Vietnamese staging area. Command had underestimated the scale and strength of the enemy forces in the area. Intelligence had suggested light resistance, perhaps some scattered Viet Cong. In reality, entire regiments of the North Vietnamese Army were already watching them, waiting for nightfall. By evening, Coral was still barely a functioning base. Perimeter wire wasn't in place. Gun pits were shallow. Defensive arcs hadn't been fully coordinated. Soldiers ate from ration tins and tried to get some rest under their hooches, but unease was thick in the air. Then came the first sign: distant movement, cracking branches, faint rustling in the jungle. Some soldiers swore they heard whispers in Vietnamese. Suddenly, red tracer rounds ripped through the dark. The Australians were no longer alone, and Fire Support Base Coral was no longer just a map coordinate. It was a target. The opening act of the Battle of Coral Balmoral had begun, and the men on the ground were about to face one of the most chaotic and desperate nights in Australia's military history. The night of May 12th gave the men at Coral little sleep. Patrols returned, reporting movement just beyond the tree line. There were sounds that didn't belong to the jungle. Metallic clicks, short commands in Vietnamese, the unnatural silence of an enemy preparing to strike. By 3:30 a.m. on May 13th, the darkness lit up with a thunderclap of gunfire. The North Vietnamese army had begun their attack, and they weren't probing the lines. They were coming in hard, fast, and in overwhelming numbers. Hundreds of NVA soldiers launched a coordinated assault straight at the heart of the fire support base. Their objective was clear: overrun Coral, silence the artillery, and wipe out the Australians before they could fully establish themselves. The outer pickets were the first to take the brunt. Claymore mines detonated, flares went up, illuminating silhouettes sprinting through the trees. Australian infantry opened fire, but the sheer volume of enemy troops shocked everyone. In minutes, parts of the defensive perimeter began to collapse. The 102nd Field Battery, Royal Australian Artillery, suddenly found themselves in a life-or-death struggle, not with indirect fire, but with rifles and bayonets. Artillerymen, trained to work behind the lines, were now fighting at point-blank range. Many grabbed their personal weapons. Some fought with pistols. One gun crew was entirely overrun. The NVA reached the guns, knocking out 2 artillery pieces and briefly capturing their positions. At one point, hand-to-hand combat broke out inside the gun pits. The Australians refused to fall back. They held the line gun by gun, foxhole by foxhole, buying time for reinforcements and reorganizing their defense under withering fire. Communications were patchy. Chaos reigned, but discipline held. Officers and NCOs directed their men as best they could in the confusion. Artillery units fired beehive rounds, massive canisters packed with thousands of steel flechettes, directly into the advancing waves. The rounds ripped through trees and flesh alike. It was brutal, but it was the only thing that stopped the assault from breaking completely through. American helicopter crews, aware of the scale of the assault, flew resupply runs and medevacs under fire. U.S. air support was requested and delivered with speed and precision, hammering NVA positions outside the base perimeter. By dawn, the Australians had managed to stabilize Coral. The enemy pulled back, leaving behind their dead. The field was littered with bodies, many of them within meters of the artillery guns. Some had died trying to set explosives on the barrels. Others still had grenades in their hands. 9 Australians were killed in the initial attack. Over 100 enemy troops were confirmed dead, but many more were likely dragged away into the jungle. It had been one of the fiercest nights any Australian soldier would experience in Vietnam. But the battle wasn't over. Not even close. The men at Coral had survived a near overrun, but they knew it wouldn't be the last assault. The base had to be fortified. The artillery guns had to keep firing, and the NVA, emboldened by how close they had come, were already preparing to return. What was meant to be a temporary fire base had become a frontline fortress, and Coral was now the epicenter of a fight that would stretch for weeks. For the first time in the war, Australian troops had faced a full-scale, conventional assault by a determined enemy force, and survived. But survival had come at a cost. The next battle would demand even more. The first assault had shaken Coral to its core, but it had also revealed something critical. The Australians could hold their ground. With the perimeter barely intact and casualties still being counted, commanders wasted no time. Coral had to be turned into a fortress. Fast. Engineers began working around the clock. Defensive trenches were deepened. Sandbags were stacked higher. Concertina wire was strung across likely enemy approach routes. Fighting pits were reinforced. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air as exhausted soldiers dug, hauled, and rebuilt. Command acknowledged the gravity of the situation. Coral was no longer a temporary fire base. It was now a strategic anchor point, and it needed more than infantry and artillery. Soon, armored support arrived. Centurion tanks from C Squadron, 1st Armored Regiment, strolled into Coral. The first time Australian tanks had been deployed in the Vietnam War. Their 105mm guns and heavy armor gave the base a new backbone. Alongside them came M113 armored personnel carriers, APCs, enhancing mobility and firepower for patrols. Reinforcements included fresh troops, additional artillery pieces, and medical support. A second fire support base was planned a few kilometers to the north, one that would soon be known as Balmoral. The soldiers knew the enemy was still watching. Each night, flares lit the sky. Perimeter alarms went off. Shots were exchanged at the edges of the wire. The NVA wasn't retreating, they were regrouping. Despite the constant pressure, morale held. The men now had armor, air support, and a sense of purpose. They had survived the worst night of their lives, and they weren't about to let Coral fall. The next battle would be fought on stronger ground. But the enemy was preparing too, and they weren't finished testing the Australians. Balmoral would be next. While Coral was being hardened into a fortress, Australian command took the fight to the enemy. A new fire base was established roughly 4 kilometers to the north. Fire Support Base Balmoral. It was positioned deep in enemy-controlled territory, close to known NVA infiltration routes. The intent was simple: cut off enemy movement and force them into battle on Australian terms. Balmoral was built fast and strong, drawing hard lessons from Coral. Trenches were properly dug, wire laid, and armored units placed at the perimeter from day one. The NVA knew Balmoral's location, and they came for it quickly. On the night of May 26th, the first major assault began. Around 3:45 a.m., the jungle once again lit up with mortar fire and rockets. The base was rocked by blasts. Then came the infantry. 2 battalions of North Vietnamese soldiers surged forward under the cover of darkness, aiming to breach Balmoral's perimeter. But this time they faced not just dug-in infantry, they faced Centurion tanks, APCs, and a fully alert defense line. The tanks opened fire with high explosive shells, shredding enemy formations. Beehive rounds from artillery and flechette shells from APCs turned the killing zones into firestorms. Infantry held steady, rotating positions, conserving ammunition, and laying down disciplined fire. The NVA attack was repelled with brutal efficiency. Bodies were found within meters of the wire, some tangled in it, others cut down in full sprint. Australian casualties were minimal. Enemy losses were staggering, but they weren't done. On May 28th, the NVA launched a second major assault on Balmoral. This time they came heavier. More mortars, more RPPs, more manpower. The pattern was the same: bombard the base, then storm it in waves. But again, the Australians held. Tanks fired over open sights into advancing infantry columns. Machine guns poured lead across the fields. The jungle caught fire in places. A handful of NVA breached the outer wire, but they were cut down before they could cause real damage. By sunrise, the attack had failed. Dozens of enemy dead lay outside the base. Australian casualties were light. Only 3 soldiers killed across both major engagements at Balmoral. The defenders had turned the tables. Where Coral had been caught off guard, Balmoral was a demonstration of evolved tactics, hardened defenses, and the overwhelming advantage of combined arms warfare. For the NVA, it was a costly defeat. They never launched another full-scale assault against an Australian fire support base for the remainder of the war. For the Australians, Balmoral wasn't just a battlefield. It was proof that they had adapted, endured, and won. But the fighting wasn't over yet. Patrols continued. Ambushes were frequent. The jungle never truly went silent. By early June, the operation began winding down. The bases would eventually be dismantled, but the memory of what happened at Coral and Balmoral would stay burned into the minds of every soldier who survived. When the guns finally fell silent in early June 1968, the Australians had been in near continuous contact with the enemy for over 3 weeks. The Battle of Coral-Balmoral was more than a series of engagements. It was a grinding test of endurance, tactics, and survival in some of the harshest conditions of the Vietnam War. The final tally was sobering. 26 Australians, 99 wounded. More than 260 enemy dead were confirmed, with many more likely carried off or buried in the surrounding jungle. Entire NVA regiments had been thrown against the Australian positions and broken, but the impact of the battle went far beyond the numbers. Coral-Balmoral marked the first time Australian troops had fought in a conventional, sustained battle involving large-scale enemy formations, tanks, artillery, and fixed defenses. It wasn't guerrilla warfare in the jungle. It was set-piece battle, Dug-in positions, wave attacks, and direct fire support. The kind of fighting many thought was left behind after World War II and Korea. The experience transformed how Australia operated in Vietnam. Before Coral, Australian tactics emphasized small-scale patrols, quick ambushes, and counterinsurgency. After Coral, commanders placed more value on integrating tanks, APCs, and artillery into their operations. Combined arms warfare, the coordination of infantry, armor, engineers, and air support, had proven its worth in the most brutal way possible. The battle also reinforced the need for better intelligence, more secure landing zones, and prepared fire bases. Coral had almost been lost in the first 24 hours because of poor planning and underestimated enemy strength. Balmoral, by contrast, was a textbook defense, and a decisive one. On a strategic level, Balmoral helped disrupt North Vietnamese plans to regroup after Tet. It denied them control of a key staging area and inflicted heavy losses on experienced enemy units. It also showed that Australian forces, though smaller in number compared to their American allies, could hold their own in high-intensity combat. But perhaps the greatest impact was psychological. The men who fought at Coral and Balmoral knew how close it had come to disaster. They saw what happened when defenses weren't ready and what it took to recover under fire. They earned every inch of that survival, and they carried the weight of it long after the jungle fell quiet. For years, the Battle of Balmoral remained a quiet chapter in Australia's military history. There were no grand parades, no headlines. It was overshadowed by political debates at home, anti-war protests, and the broader American narrative of the Vietnam War. But for the men who fought there, it was unforgettable. Coral and Balmoral were where theory met reality, where training was tested by chaos, and where mateship became survival. Soldiers who had arrived in Vietnam expecting small patrols and jungle skirmishes found themselves in dugouts, repelling mass assaults like something out of the First World War. The emotional toll ran deep. Many veterans spoke of the trauma they carried home, of the comrades they buried, of the silence they faced when they returned. For years, official recognition was minimal. There was no battle honor, no unit citation. It was as if the battle had never happened. That changed in 2008, 40 years after the last shots were fired. The Australian government finally awarded a unit citation for gallantry to the members of the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, for their role in the battle. Later, this recognition was extended to others who had served at Coral and Balmoral. Artillery, armor, engineers, medics, and infantry alike. It was a long overdue acknowledgement of courage, resilience, and sacrifice. Today, Balmoral is remembered as one of the defining moments of Australia's involvement in Vietnam. Monuments have been built, ceremonies are held each May, and the names of the fallen are spoken aloud, not just in Australia, but by historians and military students across the world. It stands as a reminder that even in a war marked by politics and public doubt, some battles were fought with unquestionable bravery. That even in unfamiliar terrain, thousands of miles from home, soldiers found the strength to stand their ground. Balmoral wasn't just a battle, it was a turning point. And for those who fought it, it was the fight of their lives. Balmoral was never about glory, it was about grit, about men who were thrown into a fight they didn't expect and refused to break. They dug in, they stood their ground, they adapted, held the line, and pushed back against a force that was supposed to overrun them. In a war filled with confusion, controversy, and chaos, this battle stood out as something brutally clear, a test of survival and a testament to what Australian soldiers were capable of under the worst conditions imaginable. For American viewers, it's a reminder that they weren't the only ones bleeding in the jungles of Vietnam. Their allies, especially the Australians, carried their share, and more. Shoulder to shoulder, under fire, they held the line together. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. These stories matter, not just to those who live them, but to anyone who wants to understand the cost of war and the strength it demands. It was supposed to be a routine patrol. It turned into a bloodbath. On July 2nd, 1967, U.S. Marines from the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, a unit known as the Walking Dead, marched into the tall grass near Quang Tri, a remote outpost in Vietnam. They had no idea they were walking straight into a carefully planned North Vietnamese Army NVA ambush. Within minutes, gunfire and explosions ripped through their ranks. The enemy was everywhere, hidden in bunkers, dug in trenches and thick vegetation. The battle that followed became one of the deadliest engagements of the Vietnam War. Outnumbered and surrounded, the Marines fought desperately to survive. Some held their ground as their ammunition ran out. Others played dead to avoid execution. Reinforcements rushed in, but they too were slaughtered in a second ambush. By the time the battle ended, nearly an entire Marine company had been wiped out. Operation Buffalo became a symbol of both American courage and the brutal reality of war. What really happened that day? Why did so many Marines die? And how did the survivors make it out alive? This is the untold story of Operation Buffalo, where heroes were made, lives were lost, and the cost of war was paid in blood. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe now. This is history you won't forget. 2. The strategic importance of Quang Tri. In 1967, the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ in Vietnam, was anything but peaceful. The area separating North and South Vietnam was supposed to be a buffer zone, but instead it became one of the most dangerous battlefields of the war. Quang Tri, a small U.S. Marine Corps outpost near the DMZ, sat right in the middle of this chaos. The U.S. military needed Quang Tri to block North Vietnamese Army, NVA troops, from flooding into South Vietnam. From this base, American forces could launch attacks, spot enemy movements, and protect key supply routes. But the NVA saw Quang Tri as a threat to their plans. They wanted it wiped off the map. For months before Operation Buffalo, NVA artillery pounded Quang Tri. Enemy mortars and rockets rained down daily, turning the outpost into a living nightmare. The Marines there faced constant attacks, sniper fire, and brutal trench warfare. By mid-1967, U.S. commanders knew the enemy was preparing something big. Intelligence reports showed thousands of NVA troops gathering near the DMZ, but instead of waiting to be attacked, the U.S. launched Operation Buffalo, a mission to take control of the area and crush enemy forces before they could strike. What the Marines didn't know was that the NVA was already waiting for them, hidden and ready to kill. The stage was set. The battle was about to begin. When Operation Buffalo began, both sides were prepared for a fight, but only one side knew it was coming. The United States Marine Corps believed they were launching an offensive to clear out enemy forces near Quang Tri, but the North Vietnamese Army, NVM, had already set a deadly trap. United States forces, the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, 1/9, led the operation. This unit had already earned a reputation for toughness, but they would soon suffer so many casualties that they became known as the Walking Dead. Reinforcements came from the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, along with support from artillery, airstrikes, and naval gunfire. The U.S. also deployed F-4 Phantom jets, A-4 Skyhawks, and B-52 bombers to hammer enemy positions. North Vietnamese Army, the 324B Division, 90th Regiment of the NVA, was no ordinary force. These battle-hardened troops were skilled in ambush tactics, bunker warfare, and close-quarters combat. They were supported by hidden artillery positions across the DMZ, allowing them to strike American forces while remaining safe in North Vietnam. Unlike the U.S. Marines, the NVA had been preparing for this battle for weeks. They had dug bunkers, hidden machine gun nests, and set up deadly kill zones. They wanted the Marines to come. They wanted them to walk straight into their trap. On July 2, 1967, that trap was sprung. The bloodbath began. The battle begins. Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines set out from Quang Tri. Their mission was simple: patrol Highway 561, a key dirt road running through the war-torn landscape near the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ. The goal was to clear enemy forces and secure the area for future operations. The Marines moved cautiously, but everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. Thick elephant grass and scattered tree lines made it hard to see ahead. The morning air was heavy with humidity, and the Marines wiped sweat from their faces as they pushed forward. Some felt uneasy. They had been in Vietnam long enough to know that when the enemy was silent, something was wrong. Then at 9:15 a.m., the silence shattered. Without warning, heavy machine gun fire and mortar rounds exploded all around them. Marines were cut down instantly as bullets tore through their ranks. Screams of wounded men filled the air. The North Vietnamese had been waiting, hidden in deep trenches and reinforced bunkers. Captain Sterling Coates, the commanding officer of Alpha Company, was killed almost immediately. With their leader down and radio signals jammed, the Marines were in chaos. They had walked straight into a kill zone, and the enemy was closing in. Some tried to return fire, but they were pinned down. Others attempted to retreat, only to find enemy forces behind them as well. They were surrounded. The trap had been set, and it had worked perfectly. For Alpha Company, the fight for survival had just begun. The NVA ambush. The Marines of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines were trapped. Machine guns, mortars, and RPGs rained down on them from all directions. Within minutes, dozens of Marines lay dead or wounded. Those who could still fight scrambled for cover, but there was nowhere to hide. The enemy had the advantage. They had planned this ambush for weeks. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA 90th Regiment, had set up a near-perfect kill zone. Bunkers and trenches were hidden under thick grass, giving the enemy complete cover. Machine guns and snipers were positioned at strategic points, cutting off any escape. The Marines were being ripped apart before they even had a chance to react. The chaos of battle, with Captain Sterling Coates dead, command fell into disarray. Communications were jammed by the enemy, leaving the Marines unable to call for help. Some squads tried to advance, but they were cut down almost immediately. Others tried to retreat, only to run straight into more hidden enemy forces. Marines fought back as best they could, returning fire in short bursts, crawling through blood-soaked grass, and using the bodies of fallen comrades for cover. Some fought hand-to-hand as NVA soldiers emerged from their trenches, stabbing and shooting at point-blank range. Navy corpsmen, the battlefield medics, worked desperately to treat the wounded, often shielding dying Marines with their own bodies. Many were killed as they tried to save their brothers. Surrounded with no escape by midday, Alpha Company was nearly wiped out. Out of 140 Marines, only a handful were still able to fight. The rest were either dead, wounded, or missing. Some survivors played dead, hoping the enemy wouldn't execute them. Others made last stands, firing their last bullets before being overrun. But the battle wasn't over. Reinforcements were coming, and the NVA was ready for them too. Operation Buffalo was quickly turning into a nightmare. 6. A desperate fight for survival. The battlefield was a nightmare. Smoke and dust filled the air, mixing with the screams of the wounded and the deafening sound of gunfire. Alpha Company was almost gone. The Marines who could still fight were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely surrounded. The North Vietnamese were not just attacking from a distance, they were moving in to finish the job. Fighting to the last bullet. Some Marines refused to give up. With no clear orders and no way to communicate, small groups of men fought on their own, holding their positions until the very end. They fired from bomb craters, behind the bodies of fallen comrades, and from whatever cover they could find. Many fought until their rifles were empty, then switched to grenades, knives, and even their bare hands. Lance Corporal Billy Singleton, already wounded, saw an NVA soldier advancing on him. Out of ammo, he grabbed his entrenching tool, a small shovel, and smashed the enemy soldier's skull before crawling to cover. He was one of the few to make it out alive. The heroic efforts of Navy corpsmen. The battlefield medics, known as Navy corpsmen, performed acts of pure bravery. Under heavy fire, they dragged wounded Marines to safety, used their own bodies as shields, and tried to keep their brothers alive. One corpsman, Donald McLaren, ran through enemy fire to save a wounded Marine. Just as he reached him, a bullet tore through his own body, but he refused to stop. He patched up the Marine and dragged him back to cover before collapsing from blood loss. Some played dead to survive. For many Marines, fighting wasn't an option. The NVA was executing the wounded, finishing off any Marine still moving. Some Marines, covered in the blood of their dead friends, pretended to be dead, lying motionless as enemy soldiers walked past them. One survivor later recalled watching an NVA soldier bayonet his fallen friends one by one, making sure no one was alive. He held his breath and prayed they would pass him by. By the time reinforcements were on their way, it was too late for most of Alpha Company. But the bloodshed was far from over. News of Alpha Company's destruction spread quickly. By mid-afternoon on July 2nd, 1967, U.S. commanders realized they had just lost an entire Marine company. They immediately ordered Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines to move in and rescue any survivors. But the NVA had planned for this too. Bravo Company moved cautiously, advancing toward the last known position of Alpha Company. They didn't know they were walking into a second ambush. The second trap. As Bravo Company approached the battlefield, NVA machine guns opened fire from hidden bunkers. Mortar shells exploded around them, sending Marines flying. Within minutes, the rescue mission turned into another slaughter. The NVA had dug deep, reinforced trenches, allowing them to fire, disappear, and move unseen. U.S. Marines tried to push forward, but every step was met with deadly resistance. One Marine, Lance Corporal James O'Connor, recalled crawling through the grass, watching his fellow Marines drop one by one. "Everywhere I looked, there were bodies," he later said. "We never saw them coming." Reinforcements keep coming. As the sun began to set, more Marine units from the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines were sent in. The NVA continued to fight fiercely, refusing to retreat. By the end of the day, over 80 more Marines were dead. The battle was spiraling out of control. The U.S. needed a new plan, one that didn't involve sending more men into the enemy's kill zones. The next move would be massive. By July 3rd, 1967, it was clear that sending more Marines into the enemy's kill zones was suicide. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, was too well dug in. Their ambushes too deadly. U.S. commanders needed to change tactics. Instead of marching more men into the trap, they decided to bring the full power of American firepower down on the enemy. Carpet bombing and artillery barrages. At dawn, the U.S. launched one of the most intense bombardments of the war. B-52 bombers carpet bombed the battlefield, dropping thousands of pounds of explosives. F-4 Phantom jets and A-4 Skyhawks unleashed napalm and cluster bombs, setting entire sections of the jungle on fire. Naval gunfire from offshore warships pounded NVA positions with heavy artillery. The ground shook as fire and explosions consumed the enemy bunkers. The NVA had dug deep, but no trench was safe from the relentless bombing. Marines launch a brutal counterattack. After hours of bombardment, 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, 3/9, launched a full assault. Moving in with tanks and armored vehicles, the Marines fought trench to trench, clearing out NVA positions one by one. Many NVA soldiers, realizing they were losing, fought to the death. Others tried to retreat but were cut down by U.S. airstrikes and artillery. The battle turned into close-quarters combat, with Marines using flamethrowers, grenades, and bayonets to clear bunkers. The NVA finally withdraws. After 2 days of relentless fighting, the NVA finally abandoned the battlefield, leaving behind hundreds of dead soldiers and destroyed weapons. The Marines had won the fight, but at a terrible cost. Operation Buffalo had crippled the NVA's ability to operate in the area, but the U.S. paid for it in blood. The battle was over, but the suffering had just begun. The battle was over, but the damage was done. Operation Buffalo had turned into one of the deadliest battles of the Vietnam War for U.S. Marines. The human cost. The final toll was staggering: 159 Marines killed, 345 Marines wounded, over 1,290 North Vietnamese soldiers dead. The Marines of 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, 1/9. The Walking Dead had been nearly wiped out. Some survivors were rescued days later, found hiding among the bodies of their fallen brothers. Others were missing, some captured, some never found. Many of the Marines who made it out alive were physically and mentally scarred forever. The horrors of the battle, the sight of friends being gunned down or executed, haunted them for the rest of their lives. What went wrong? Operation Buffalo exposed major failures in U.S. intelligence and strategy. The NVA was far more prepared than expected. Marine patrols were sent in without enough support. The enemy used superior ambush tactics, forcing Marines into deadly kill zones. Some officers later admitted that the operation should have never been carried out as planned. The Marines had been sent into a trap, and they paid the price. a costly victory. In the end, the U.S. declared Operation Buffalo a success because they had inflicted heavy losses on the enemy. But for the Marines who fought there, it felt like anything but a victory. The battle proved one thing. The NVA was not afraid of fighting U.S. forces head-on, and they were willing to pay the price in blood. The war was far from over. The 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, 1/9, had always been a tough unit, but after Operation Buffalo, they earned a new name, the Walking Dead. The nickname came from their incredibly high casualty rate throughout the Vietnam War. No other Marine unit suffered as many losses. By the end of Operation Buffalo, nearly an entire company had been wiped out. The survivors were physically and emotionally shattered. Many had watched their closest friends die in front of them. Some had barely escaped, playing dead among fallen Marines to avoid execution. The battle left deep scars on those who lived through it. Many struggled with survivors' guilt, nightmares, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, for the rest of their lives. The brutality of the ambush, the sight of Marines being cut down in seconds, never left them. Despite the horrors they faced, the Marines of 19 never backed down. They continued to fight in some of the toughest battles of the war, always standing their ground no matter the odds. Their courage became legendary. Years later, veterans of the battalion gathered to honor their fallen brothers, ensuring that the sacrifices made during Operation Buffalo would never be forgotten. The Walking Dead had earned their name, but they were never truly defeated. 11th. Operation Buffalo became one of the most studied battles of the Vietnam War. It showed the bravery of U.S. Marines, but also exposed the deadly effectiveness of North Vietnamese ambush tactics. Military leaders later used it as a lesson in combat strategy, reconnaissance failures, and the cost of underestimating the enemy. For the Marines who fought there, however, it was more than just history. It was a memory that never faded. Many who survived carried the weight of what happened for the rest of their lives. The sights, sounds, and smells of the battlefield stayed with them, haunting their dreams. Some never spoke about it. Others spent years trying to make sense of what they had lived through. Today, the men of the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, the Walking Dead, are honored for their sacrifice. Veterans' reunions, memorials, and books ensure that the names of the fallen are never forgotten. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C., bears the names of many Marines who lost their lives in Operation Buffalo. Both American and Vietnamese veterans who fought in this battle later reflected on the cost of war. Some met decades later, not as enemies, but as soldiers who had survived the same nightmare. Operation Buffalo was a tragedy, but it also became a symbol of the courage, resilience, and sacrifice of those who fought in Vietnam. Operation Buffalo was more than just another battle in the Vietnam War. It was a test of courage, survival, and sacrifice. The Marines of 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, the Walking Dead, walked into a nightmare, fought with everything they had, and suffered horrific losses. Despite the ambush, despite being outnumbered and surrounded, they refused to give up. This battle exposed the brutality of the Vietnam War. It showed how deadly the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, could be and how dangerous it was to underestimate them. It also proved the unbreakable spirit of the U.S. Marines, who fought against impossible odds and never backed down. For those who survived, the memories of July 2nd to 3rd, 1967, never faded. They carried the weight of that battle for the rest of their lives. Many of them returned home to a country that didn't fully understand what they had been through. But their story matters. Their sacrifices matter. History remembers battles, but it's the people who fought them that truly define them. The men of Operation Buffalo paid a terrible price, and it's our duty to remember what they went through. Before we continue, take a moment to thank the brave veterans who fought in Khe Sanh. Their sacrifice will never be forgotten. Imagine being trapped in a battlefield for 77 days, surrounded by the enemy, with little food, water, or sleep. Explosions shake the ground, bullets whiz past, and every moment could be your last. This was the Siege of Khe Sanh, one of the most intense and brutal battles of the Vietnam War. In January 1968, 6,000 U.S. Marines were stationed at Khe Sanh Combat Base, a remote outpost near the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They knew something was coming, Strange things were happening in the jungle. Patrols stopped leaving the base. Then a chilling warning came from a North Vietnamese officer. An attack was coming at midnight. On January 21, 1968, all hell broke loose. 20,000 North Vietnamese Army (NVA) troops launched a massive assault, determined to crush the Marines. The battle that followed was a nightmare. Soldiers fought in deep trenches, endured endless artillery fire, and survived on minimal supplies. It was a fight for survival. For over 2 months, the Marines stood their ground, proving their courage and resilience. The Siege of Khe Sanh became one of the most legendary battles of the Vietnam War. The Marines could feel something was wrong. The jungle around them was too quiet. Strange things started happening that made their skin crawl. Shadows moved in the trees and eerie sounds echoed through the dense forest. It felt like they were being watched. Patrols were normally sent out to check the area, but suddenly they were ordered to stay inside the base. The gates were sealed shut. This was not a normal procedure. Something was coming. Then the Marines spotted enemy soldiers on a ridge 500 yards away. Without hesitation, they called in a 105mm howitzer strike. After about 12 shells, a Marine patrol was sent out to inspect the results. What they found was chilling: pools of blood and drag marks leading into the jungle. The enemy had suffered losses, but they had carried away their dead and wounded. The patrol requested permission to follow the trail into the trees, but the answer came back quickly: return to base immediately. The Marines were confused and uneasy. Why weren't they allowed to pursue the enemy? What were the commanders afraid of? Then something even more unsettling happened. A Vietnamese officer appeared outside the base's wire, holding a white cloth as a sign of truce. He delivered a terrifying message. At midnight, we will attack hills 861 and 881. By sunrise, the base will fall. With those words, he turned and walked away. The Marines spent the next few hours preparing for battle. They gripped their rifles, their eyes scanning the darkness, waiting for the enemy to strike. Midnight was coming fast. Then something truly terrifying happened. From deep in the jungle, laughter echoed through the night. It wasn't normal laughter. It was eerie, high-pitched, and inhuman. The Marines couldn't see them, but they knew. The enemy was already cutting through the first row of wire. At that moment, a green flare shot into the sky. And then, all hell broke loose. The moment the green flare lit up the sky, the night exploded into chaos. Gunfire, mortars, and artillery shells rained down on the Marines at Khe Sanh combat base. The enemy had launched their full-scale attack. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, numbering over 20,000 troops, came from all sides. They had been preparing for this moment for months, digging trenches and tunnels to get closer to the base. Now they were charging forward, determined to wipe out the 6,000 Marines defending Khe Sanh. The Marines were ready. They had been waiting for this moment, and the second the enemy came into view, they opened fire with everything they had. Machine guns roared, mortars fired, and grenades exploded as the defenders held their ground. But the enemy was relentless. The NVA cut through the wire, ignoring their own heavy losses. Wave after wave of soldiers threw themselves at the defenses. Some managed to get inside, forcing brutal hand-to-hand combat in the trenches. Then the radio crackled with a chilling message. Enemy forces had been spotted near the southern wire. The Marines braced for another assault. Suddenly, a massive explosion shook the base. The NVA had hit an ammunition dump, causing a huge fireball that lit up the battlefield. The ground trembled as thousands of rounds of ammunition detonated, sending shrapnel in all directions. As if that wasn't bad enough, another artillery shell hit a stockpile of tear gas. A thick, blinding cloud spread across the base, choking the defenders. Marines coughed, their eyes burning, but they couldn't stop fighting. By morning, the first wave of the attack was over. The NVA had suffered heavy casualties, but they weren't finished. Then came the next horror. Rocket and artillery fire rained down again, just as the enemy officer had warned the day before. The hills around Khe Sanh were now in enemy hands, and the base was completely surrounded. For the next 77 days, the Marines would be trapped inside Khe Sanh, facing constant bombardment, dwindling supplies, and the terrifying reality that at any moment, the enemy could come charging over the wire again. The Siege of Khe Sanh had truly begun. Would the Marines be able to hold the base? Or was this going to be another Dien Bien Phu, the famous battle where the French had been completely overrun. The next 2.5 months would decide their fate. Khe Sanh was not just any military base, it was a key position in the Vietnam War. The U.S. military had established it to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a crucial supply route used by the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, to transport weapons, food, and troops into South Vietnam. For the North Vietnamese, Khe Sanh was an obstacle in their war effort. If they could destroy the base, they would gain complete control over the region, making it easier to launch attacks across South Vietnam. But there was another reason why Khe Sanh was so important: psychological warfare. The NVA wanted a major victory against the Americans, one that would weaken U.S. morale and turn public opinion against the war. Many historians believe that the Battle of Khe Sanh was designed to mirror the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, where the Vietnamese defeated the French, forcing them to leave Vietnam. The U.S. military, however, saw Khe Sanh as a test of American strength. They refused to abandon the base, believing that holding it would prove U.S. superiority and keep the enemy from advancing further south. This led to one of the bloodiest sieges in modern history. Both sides were willing to suffer enormous losses to control Khe Sanh. But while the U.S. was focused on defending the base, the NVA had another plan in motion, one that would take the entire war in a new direction. As the Marines fought to survive at Khe Sanh, something even bigger was about to happen: the Tet Offensive. The first night of the Siege of Khe Sanh was pure chaos. The Marines were outnumbered, but they were determined to hold their ground. The NVA forces attacked in waves, throwing everything they had at the defenders. They used rockets, mortars, and artillery, pounding the base from the hills around it. The Marines fired back, machine guns rattling as they tried to cut down the enemy before they reached the wire. In the darkness, forward artillery observer Dennis Mannion was moving through the trenches, armed with only a .45 caliber pistol. He could barely see in the blackness, feeling his way along the trench walls. Then suddenly, he touched something soft: hair. Before he could react, he realized it was an NVA soldier inside the base. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger, taking down the enemy before moving forward to call in more artillery strikes. The battle raged on, with close quarters combat in the trenches. Marines fought with rifles, pistols, bayonets, and even their bare hands. It was a brutal fight for survival. Then came one of the worst moments of the night: a direct hit on the base's ammunition dump. The explosion was so powerful it lit up the night sky, sending a shockwave across Khe Sanh. The blast destroyed much of the base's stored ammunition, making it even harder for the Marines to defend themselves. But the nightmare wasn't over. Another artillery round hit a tear gas cache, releasing thick clouds of gas across the base. Marines coughed, their eyes burning, struggling to see. Some had gas masks, but others had to fight through the choking fumes. By morning, the first wave of the attack had ended. The Marines had held their ground, but at a terrible cost. 18 Marines were killed and over 50 were wounded in just the first night. Then, just as the sun began to rise, more rockets and artillery rained down on the base. The NVA weren't stopping. They had dug in around the hills, using the high ground to keep pounding Khe Sanh with nonstop fire. The Marines were now completely surrounded. The battle was only just beginning, and the men at Khe Sanh would have to endure 77 days of hell, with no way out. The first night of the siege had been brutal, but the Marines had no time to recover. As the days passed, Khe Sanh was pounded by relentless artillery fire. Every single day, over 1,000 enemy shells slammed into the base. The Marines were trapped. They couldn't leave, and no reinforcements could reach them by land. The only way to get supplies was through airdrops and helicopters, but even that was risky. The NVA controlled the surrounding hills, making any movement outside the trenches suicidal. Life in Khe Sanh became a nightmare. The Marines lived in muddy trenches and bunkers, constantly on edge. Sleep was almost impossible. Every time they tried to rest, another explosion would shake the ground, throwing dirt and debris into the air. There was no fresh food or clean water. Supplies were dropped by parachute, but the NVA would shell the drop zones before the Marines could retrieve anything. Sometimes food was destroyed before they could even reach it. Water was even worse. Many Marines went days without drinking anything in the sweltering jungle heat. The conditions inside the base were horrific. Bodies piled up, and with no time for proper burials, The dead rotted under the sun. Rats swarmed over the corpses, chewing on the fallen. Marines would wake up to find rats crawling on their bodies, trying to bite their flesh. Clothing disintegrated from the constant rain, mud, and filth. Some Marines went the entire 77 days in the same uniform, which had turned to rags by the end of the siege. The worst part? The shelling never stopped. The NVA had surrounded Khe Sanh, positioning artillery, mortars, and rocket launchers in the hills. From their elevated positions, they rained down destruction every single day. No place was safe. If a Marine tried to step out of a bunker, he risked instant death. The constant bombardment had strange effects on the Marines. Many developed a condition known as shell shock, now called PTSD. The never-ending explosions and the fear of death made some soldiers freeze in terror, unable to function. Others became numb, no longer reacting to the horror around them. Despite all this, the Marines fought back fiercely. Every time the NVA launched an attack, the defenders held their ground, refusing to surrender. Close air support missions became the Marines' lifeline. B-52 bombers dropped tons of napalm and explosives, creating a ring of fire around Khe Sanh. Helicopters rushed in with supplies, but the NVA shot many of them down. 7 helicopters were destroyed in the first month alone. For the Marines, every day was the same: bombardment, hunger, exhaustion, and death. They had no idea how long they could last. But they refused to break. As the siege continued, the U.S. military planned a desperate operation to break the enemy's grip on Khe Sanh. The Marines at Khe Sanh were fighting against impossible odds. Outnumbered nearly 4-1, they faced daily artillery barrages, sniper fire, and relentless ground attacks. The NVA was determined to crush them, but the Marines refused to surrender. Every day, the enemy bombarded the base with rockets, mortars, and heavy artillery. Some Marines started to joke bitterly, calling Khe Sanh hell on earth. The reality was no joke. 1,000 shells rained down daily, shattering bunkers and turning trenches into mass graves. Even those who weren't hit directly suffered from shell shock, their ears ringing, noses bleeding, and minds numb from the constant explosions. At night, the danger increased. The NVA would use the darkness and fog to launch surprise attacks. They would crawl through the wire, trying to sneak into the trenches. In some cases, they succeeded, leading to horrific close-quarters combat. Marines fought with bayonets, knives, and even their bare hands to push the enemy back. One Marine later described it as the closest thing to World War I trench warfare that anyone had seen in modern times. The trenches were filled with mud, blood, and the stench of rotting bodies. Despite their suffering, the Marines fought back ferociously. Every time the NVA attacked, they were met with a wall of fire. The defenders used M16 rifles, machine guns, grenades, and mortars to stop the enemy from breaking through. Snipers picked off targets from hidden positions. But the biggest advantage the Marines had was air support. B-52 bombers, fighter jets, and helicopters launched devastating strikes on enemy positions. Tons of napalm and explosives were dropped daily, turning the jungle into a firestorm. Some airstrikes were so powerful that entire enemy battalions were wiped out in minutes. Even with air superiority, Khe Sanh remained a death trap. Supplies were running low. The Marines were surviving on canned rations and whatever water they could get. Helicopters had only 25 seconds to land, unload supplies, and take off before the NVA targeted them with mortar fire. Many were shot down before they even reached the ground. By the end of the first month, 7 helicopters had been destroyed. The situation inside the base was becoming desperate. As the siege dragged on, the Marines began to wonder if they would make it out alive. The enemy showed no signs of stopping. Every night they heard the chilling sound of NVA soldiers laughing and whispering just beyond the wire, waiting for their next attack. Would Khe Sanh fall, just like the French at Dien Bien Phu? The U.S. military knew they had to act fast. A massive operation was being planned to break the siege and save the trapped Marines before it was too late. By March 1968, the situation at Khe Sanh was critical. The Marines had been trapped for over 2 months, enduring constant bombardment, hunger, and exhaustion. Supplies were running dangerously low, and the NVA showed no signs of stopping. If the siege continued much longer, the base might not survive. The U.S. military knew they had to act fast. They launched Operation Pegasus, a massive air and ground offensive designed to break through enemy lines and rescue the Marines at Khe Sanh. The 1st Air Cavalry Division, one of the most elite units in the U.S. Army, led the assault. They used a combination of helicopter airlifts, artillery barrages, and close air support to push back the NVA forces. The operation was also supported by U.S. Marines, South Vietnamese troops, and armored units, all fighting to reopen the road to Khe Sanh. The battle was fierce. The NVA had spent months digging trenches, bunkers, and tunnels in the hills surrounding the base. They fought desperately, knowing that losing Khe Sanh would be a massive defeat for them. But the U.S. forces had a major advantage: firepower. B-52 bombers, fighter jets, and heavy artillery pounded enemy positions, forcing the NVA to retreat. Helicopters dropped troops behind enemy lines, cutting off their escape routes. By April 8, 1968, after nearly 3 months of brutal fighting, U.S. forces finally broke through and reached Khe Sanh. The Marines, who had been trapped for 77 days, were finally rescued. The Siege of Khe Sanh was officially over. However, the battle had come at a terrible cost. Hundreds of U.S. troops had been killed or wounded, and thousands of NVA soldiers had died trying to take the base. With the siege broken, the U.S. military faced a difficult decision. Should they keep the base or abandon it? The answer would come just a few months later, in one of the most controversial moves of the entire war. Even though Operation Pegasus had successfully broken the 77-day siege, the U.S. military faced a tough decision. Should they continue defending Khe Sanh or abandon it? By June 1968, the decision was made. Khe Sanh would be evacuated. The base had become too costly to defend, and its strategic importance had diminished after the Tet Offensive changed the course of the war. The evacuation had to be done carefully and in secret. If the NVA realized the base was being abandoned, they could launch a final assault and wipe out the remaining Marines. Over the next few weeks, thousands of troops, weapons, and equipment were quietly withdrawn. The last Marines left on July 11, 1968, under the cover of darkness. To prevent the NVA from using the base, the U.S. forces destroyed bunkers, trenches, and runways before leaving. When the North Vietnamese army finally took over Khe Sanh, they found little more than ruins. The evacuation was highly controversial. Many questioned why the U.S. had sacrificed so much to defend Khe Sanh, only to abandon it just months later. Some compared it to the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, but military leaders argued that the Marines had held their ground and left on their own terms. The battle had been won, but at a terrible cost. Hundreds of Americans had died, and thousands of Vietnamese soldiers had perished in a battle that ultimately changed nothing. But for the Marines who fought at Khe Sanh, the battle was more than just a strategic decision. It was a test of courage, survival, and brotherhood. They had faced overwhelming odds and endured unimaginable hardships, proving their strength and resilience in one of the longest sieges in modern military history. The Siege of Khe Sanh was one of the bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War. For 77 days, 6,000 U.S. Marines fought against 20,000 North Vietnamese troops, enduring relentless artillery fire, brutal ground assaults, and extreme conditions. The cost of the battle was staggering. Around 300 U.S. troops were killed, and over 3,000 were wounded. On the other side, the NVA suffered an estimated 15,000 casualties. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers, a haunting reminder of the horrors of war. But Khe Sanh was more than just a military battle. It became a symbol of American resilience and sacrifice. The Marines who fought there showed incredible bravery, surviving against all odds. Even though the base was later abandoned, their determination and courage left a lasting impact on military history. Many veterans who survived Khe Sanh carried the physical and emotional scars of the battle for the rest of their lives. The constant bombardment, the fear of being overrun, and the horrors they witnessed stayed with them forever. Some struggled with PTSD, while others found strength in the unbreakable brotherhood they had formed in the trenches. Today, Khe Sanh remains a powerful reminder of the sacrifices made during the Vietnam War. The battlefield has been preserved as a war memorial, honoring those who fought and died there. To all the veterans who served at Khe Sanh and in the Vietnam War, we honor your service and sacrifice. Your bravery, resilience, and dedication will never be forgotten. And to everyone watching, thank you for taking the time to learn about this incredible story. In the darkness of the South China Sea, just miles off the coast of North Vietnam, a U.S. Navy submarine floats silently beneath the surface. On board, a team of Navy SEALs prepares for a mission unlike any other. It's top secret, it's high risk, and almost no one in the military knows what they're about to do. Their target isn't a military base, it's not a weapon site, it's something far more important, a group of American prisoners of war held deep inside enemy territory. These men are planning a daring escape from the infamous Hanoi Hilton, and they'll need help if they're going to survive the journey home. The plan is bold, the mission is dangerous, and the story that follows would stay buried for decades. This is Operation Thunderhead, the last secret rescue mission of the Vietnam War. It was a mission built on courage, technology, and silence. And when it went wrong, it went tragically wrong. The U.S. government kept it quiet. The families of the men involved were given no answers. And one Navy SEAL would become the final combat casualty of a war that was supposed to be ending. This story remained classified for nearly 40 years. But now it can finally be told. Before we begin, if you enjoy deep dive history and real stories of bravery that were kept in the shadows, make sure to subscribe and give this video a like. It helps bring attention to the forgotten missions and the heroes who never came home. Let's go back to 1972. The Vietnam War is in its final stages. Peace talks are underway. But behind enemy lines, American prisoners are preparing to run for their lives. And far offshore, a submarine is waiting in the dark to bring them home. By 1972, the Vietnam War had dragged on for more than a decade. Most American combat troops were already leaving the country. The war was shifting toward diplomacy, with peace talks happening in Paris. But for hundreds of Americans held prisoner in North Vietnam, there was still no way out. These prisoners had been locked up for years. Many were tortured, starved, and kept in brutal isolation. The most feared prison was Hoa Lo, known to the world as the Hanoi Hilton. That's where a group of American pilots had been quietly planning their escape. One of them was Air Force Captain John Dramisi. He had already tried to escape once, in 1969. He was caught, beaten, and nearly killed. But he didn't stop thinking about trying again. This time, he wasn't going to do it alone. Along with fellow POWs, including Captain George McKnight and Navy Lieutenant George Coker, he came up with a plan that was incredibly risky, but just might work. They believed that if they could break out of the prison, they could follow the Red River all the way to the Gulf of Tonkin. From there, they hoped a U.S. ship or aircraft could pick them up. They didn't ask for a rescue force to come in. They just needed someone to be there when they reached the coast. Somehow, the plan made it out. A coded message was hidden in a letter home, smuggled past censors, and passed through a POW support group in the United States. It eventually reached the Pentagon. The men inside Hoa Lo were asking for help, and they were planning to move soon. At that point, everything changed. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Thomas Moore, personally approved a rescue mission, but it had to be quiet. No leaks, no headlines. With peace talks hanging in the balance, even a whisper of a rescue mission could trigger a political disaster. The operation would be handled in total secrecy. It would be small, fast, and silent. The goal to position elite U.S. forces near the Red River Delta, close enough to intercept the escaping prisoners without alerting the enemy. The name for this mission was Operation Thunderhead. It would involve submarines, mini-submarines, helicopters, and some of the Navy's most highly trained men, including a SEAL team chosen for their skill and experience. The planning moved quickly. The escape was expected in early June. That gave them just weeks to prepare and get into position. To signal the prisoners that the mission was approved, 2 U.S. Air Force SR-71 Blackbird spy planes were flown directly over Hanoi. They broke the sound barrier, causing a massive double sonic boom heard throughout the city. It was a message only the POWs would understand. The escape plan was a go. Operation Thunderhead would be America's final covert attempt to rescue prisoners during the Vietnam War. It was a mission built on hope and trust, the hope that the prisoners could escape and the trust that someone would be there to bring them home. But war is never that simple, and what happened next would turn Thunderhead from a secret rescue into a deadly disaster. Operation Thunderhead had a single purpose: to be in the right place at the right time. If the prisoners reached the coast, American forces would be there to pull them out before the enemy could stop them. But to make that possible, the Navy had to build a mission that could operate deep inside enemy territory, without being seen, heard, or exposed. The job would be given to a small group of men and machines. At the center of the plan was the USS Grayback, a specially modified submarine that could carry both people and equipment for underwater operations. Grayback had been designed for missions just like this: silent, hidden, and deadly. On board was a group of Navy SEALs from SEAL Team 1, Alpha Platoon. The team leader was Lieutenant Melvin Spence Dry, a quiet but determined officer with combat experience. He would lead the main recovery force. One of his top men was Warrant Officer Philip Moki Martin, a respected SEAL known for keeping calm under pressure. Supporting them were underwater specialists from Underwater Demolition Team 11, or UDT-11. They were experts in using small submarines called SEAL Delivery Vehicles, or SDVs. These were electric-powered, open-cockpit mini-subs designed to carry SEALs underwater for miles. The SDVs would launch from Grayback and carry the men close to shore. Above the surface, the Navy assembled a small task force. The nuclear-powered cruiser USS Long Beach would act as a command ship. A support ship, USS Harold E. Holt, joined the group. 2 Navy helicopters from Squadron HC-7 were assigned to fly night missions along the coast. These aircraft could be used for extraction if the SEALs or prisoners needed to be picked up fast. Even within the Navy, most people had no idea what this operation was really about. To keep things secret, commanders were told a cover story that they were helping to recover North Vietnamese defectors. The real goal was known only to a few top officers. One of the most unusual parts of the plan involved how the SEALs would return to the submarine. If things went well, helicopters would drop them back into the ocean, and they would dive down to the submerged Grayback. It was a difficult and dangerous maneuver, especially at night, but it was seen as the safest way to rejoin the sub without surfacing near enemy waters. The escape itself was expected in early June. Intelligence said the POWs might try to move under cover of heavy storms, when power would go out in the prison and guards would be less alert. Timing would be critical. If the SEALs were too early, they could be spotted. If they were too late, the prisoners could be captured or killed. To prepare, the SEALs and UDT teams trained hard in the Philippines and at sea. Most of them had never worked together before. Some had never used an SDV in real operations, but there was no time to wait. By late May, the task force was in position off the coast of North Vietnam. Grayback moved into the area silently and submerged. The helicopters began flying surveillance runs at night. The men on board didn't talk much. They knew what was at stake. Operation Thunderhead was ready to begin. The rescuers were in place. All they needed now was for the prisoners to make their move. On the night of June 3, 1972, the USS Grayback sat on the ocean floor, just a few miles off the coast of North Vietnam. The submarine had gone silent, waiting for the right moment to launch the SEALs. The plan was to send in a small reconnaissance team first. They would land on a small island near the mouth of the Red River and watch for signs of escaping prisoners. Lieutenant Spence Dry led the first team. With him were Warrant Officer Moki Martin and 2 UDT operators, Lieutenant Junior Grade John Lutz and Petty Officer Thomas Edwards. The 4 men loaded into a Mark 7 SEAL delivery vehicle and launched into the dark waters. The ride was immediately more difficult than expected. They had planned for calm conditions. Instead, they faced strong currents flowing out of the river. The SDV, a small battery-powered sub, wasn't strong enough to fight against the flow. It moved slowly, draining its power just to stay on course. After more than an hour, the team realized they weren't going to make it to the island. The SDV's battery was dying. If they kept going, they risked being stranded near shore, or worse, being discovered. Lieutenant Dry made the call. They aborted the mission, but now they had a problem. The SDV didn't have enough power to get back to the submarine. The men were adrift in the open sea. They couldn't leave the SDV behind either. If the enemy found it, the mission would be exposed. They used a small radio to send out a distress code. A Navy helicopter from the USS Long Beach flew out at dawn. It spotted the disabled SDV and destroyed it with gunfire to make sure it couldn't be recovered. Then it lifted the 4 men out of the water and returned them to the cruiser. But the USS Greyback, still underwater and on radio silence, had no idea any of this had happened. The sub was still waiting for them to return. By the evening of June 4th, the second SDV team was ready to launch. Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Conger, Ensign Tom McGrath, and 2 more UDT men prepared to follow the original plan. Not knowing the mission had already changed, they left Greyback and began heading toward shore. That same night, the Navy decided to return Lieutenant Dry and his original team to the submarine. With enemy patrol boats nearby and weather worsening, they had to move fast. The plan was risky. A Navy helicopter would fly them back into the sea, and they would jump into the water near the submarine. Then, using infrared beacons and lights, they would locate Greyback and dive down to re-enter it. This kind of drop had never been done under combat conditions. Dry and Martin explained the maneuver to the helicopter crew. They stressed how important it was to fly low and slow, no more than 20 feet above the water. Any higher, and the impact could be deadly. In the middle of the night, the helicopter took off from the USS Long Beach with 4 men on board: Dry, Martin, Lutz, and Edwards. The seas were rough. There was no moonlight. Wind was pushing hard from behind. Somewhere in the darkness, they saw a faint, blinking infrared light in the water. It was supposed to be Greyback's signal. They approached it, unsure. The pilot held position, and one by one, the men jumped. The signal was not from Greyback. It was from the second SDV team, who had also been forced to surface after their submersible failed. Lieutenant Spence Dry hit the water hard. Too hard. The jump had been from too high and too fast. He died instantly on impact. The other 2, Lutz and Edwards, were badly injured. Martin was the only one who landed safely. In the water, disoriented and exhausted, Martin realized what had happened. He swam through the dark and found the others, trying to keep them alive and together. The second team, Conger and the rest, had also surfaced nearby. Their SDV had flooded and stopped working. They had been floating on the surface for hours, hoping someone would find them. Now both teams were in the same spot, drifting in the sea, miles from shore, in enemy waters, with patrol boats nearby. They could hear the engines of Vietnamese gunboats in the distance. By dawn on June 5th, they had found the body of Lieutenant Dry and tied it securely so it wouldn't drift away. Martin, injured and cold, refused to leave him behind. A rescue helicopter arrived just after sunrise. It picked up all surviving members of both teams and recovered Dry's remains. The operation was officially over. The second SDV was never recovered. Both submersibles had been lost. The SEALs had never reached the shore. The prisoners had never escaped. And Operation Thunderhead had failed. Unbeknownst to everyone on the mission, the escape from the Hanoi Hilton had already been canceled. The senior American officer in the prison had called it off, fearing the prisoners would be killed if the attempt failed. But that decision never reached the men waiting offshore. The SEALs had gone in to rescue men who were no longer coming. It was a mission built on silence, courage, and trust. But it ended in darkness, confusion, and loss. Lieutenant Spence Dry became the last Navy SEAL killed during the Vietnam War, and no one outside the operation would know the truth, not for decades. After the rescue, the surviving SEALs and UDT members were flown back to the USS Long Beach. Some were treated for serious injuries. Others were shaken, but physically unharmed. All of them were exhausted. The mood on board was quiet. Everyone knew the mission had gone terribly wrong. Lieutenant Spence Dry was gone. He had jumped from the helicopter into the sea, trying to get back to his team, trying to finish the job. His body had been recovered, but the cost of that moment would stay with his men for the rest of their lives. On the USS Greyback, the crew finally received word of what had happened. The submarine had remained underwater, keeping radio silence and waiting for the team to return. Now it was clear the mission was over. Greyback's commander offered to continue the operation if the team could be reassembled. He was willing to surface and launch another attempt using inflatable boats instead of the SDVs, but it was already too late. A tropical storm, Typhoon Aura, was moving into the area. The seas were becoming too rough for any further insertions. With the weather closing in, Command made the decision to call off Operation Thunderhead completely. Over the next few days, all American forces withdrew from the area. The escape from the Hanoi Hilton never happened. Inside the prison, the senior officer had made the final call to cancel it. He believed that if even one man failed to get out, the guards would punish everyone. With peace talks showing progress, he decided the risk was too high. That decision likely saved lives. But the men offshore never knew. Back at sea, the Navy kept the mission quiet. Thunderhead was top secret. The men who had survived it were told not to speak about what happened. Even the families of those involved were kept in the dark. Lieutenant Dry's death was not listed as a combat loss. Officially, there was no record of what really happened. For years, the story of Operation Thunderhead remained hidden, buried in classified files, sealed under orders from the highest levels of the military. There were no headlines, no recognition, no closure. The mission had failed, not because of the men who carried it out, but because of things they couldn't control: bad weather, equipment failure, poor communication, and a change in plans they were never told about. Still, they had gone forward. They had followed orders. They had risked everything. And in the end, they had brought each other home. That was the quiet legacy of Operation Thunderhead, a mission no one was allowed to talk about until many years later. For decades, Operation Thunderhead remained in the shadows. The men who had taken part went back to their units or quietly left the service. No one was allowed to speak about what had happened. It was as if the mission had never existed. Lieutenant Spence Dry was buried with military honors, but the truth about his death was not made public. His family was told very little. His father, a retired Navy captain, spent years trying to learn what really happened. But the details were sealed. Even within the Navy, most people didn't know the story. The other SEALs and UDT operators who survived the mission were told to keep it quiet. They moved on with their careers, carrying the memory of what had happened in silence. But the memory didn't fade. Warrant Officer Moki Martin, who had survived the deadly drop, continued to serve in the SEALs. Later, after an unrelated injury left him paralyzed, he became a mentor to younger SEALs. He never forgot that night in 1972. The mission, the chaos, and the loss of his team leader. Like many of the men who were there, he always believed that the mission, even though it failed, had meaning. In 2008, 36 years after the operation, the U.S. government finally declassified Operation Thunderhead. The full details were released to the public. The secrecy was lifted. With that, the Navy finally recognized the sacrifice of the men involved. Lieutenant Melvin Spence Dry was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star with V for Valor, recognizing his leadership and bravery during the mission. Warrant Officer Philip Moki Martin received the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Combat Distinguishing Device for helping save lives in the aftermath of the drop. A ceremony was held at the Naval Amphibious Base in Coronado, California. Survivors of the mission were present. Some were now older, walking with canes or sitting in wheelchairs, but they stood proud, finally able to honor their fallen teammate in public. Moki Martin accepted his medal with few words. He said he accepted it on behalf of all of Alpha Platoon, the SEALs who had trained and fought together, and the ones who didn't come back. For the families, it brought some closure. For the Navy, it was a long overdue correction. For the men involved, it was a moment to finally say out loud what they had carried for decades. Operation Thunderhead had remained hidden because of its failure. But when the truth came out, it was clear, failure or not, the mission was an example of courage, loyalty, and the quiet cost of war. It reminded everyone that not all heroes come home with medals. Some come home in silence, and some don't come home at all. Operation Thunderhead was one of the last covert missions of the Vietnam War. It was also one of the quietest. For decades, it lived in the shadows, not because of shame, but because of secrecy. A mission so sensitive, so carefully hidden, that even those who risked their lives were told to stay silent. But silence doesn't erase sacrifice. The men who took part in Operation Thunderhead were prepared to give everything for a group of fellow Americans they'd never met. They trusted their mission, their team, and their training, even when the odds turned against them. They didn't know the prisoners would never escape. They didn't know their equipment would fail. They didn't know they'd be dropped into the wrong part of the sea. And they didn't know that one of them wouldn't survive the night. But they went anyway. They pushed forward in total darkness, underwater and under fire, because that's what they were trained to do. Not for medals, not for recognition, but because the job had to be done. When it ended, there was no parade, no headlines, just a line in a report that wouldn't be seen for 36 years. But history remembers them now. Lieutenant Spence Dry's name is etched into the Navy SEAL Memorial Wall, the last SEAL to die in combat during the Vietnam War. His team, Alpha Platoon, is remembered for their bravery and their loyalty, not just to each other, but to the men they tried to save. Today, Special Operations Forces train with better gear, better communication, and more support. But the lessons from Thunderhead still matter. The mission showed what happens when courage meets chaos, when a perfect plan meets an imperfect world. It proved that even a mission that fails can be filled with honor. And in the end, it left behind something stronger than silence. A story that speaks of duty, sacrifice, and the kind of courage that doesn't need to be seen to be real. If this story moved you, share it. Let someone else hear about the men of Operation Thunderhead. Let their names and their effort be remembered. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay respectful, and never forget the cost of war. These were the battles they tried to erase, but the courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood of those who fought will never fade. Every hill, every outpost, and every mission told a story of men who refused to give up, even when the world turned its back on them. To every veteran who served in Vietnam, we honor you. Your bravery shaped history, and your stories will never be forgotten.